evening, everyone. My name is Karen Ferguson, and on behalf of the Graduate Program in Urban Studies and the Center for Comparative Study of Muslim Societies and Cultures at Simon Fraser University, I'd like to welcome you to this inaugural talk in our series, Making Space, Contesting the City. This series is part of the Initiative in Urban Sustainable Development, which is generously funded by an endowment from the Real Estate Foundation of British Columbia and the Fraser Valley Real Estate Board. When we began to think about this series last year, Bill 60, the Quebec Charter of Values, was front and center in the news from coast to coast in Canada. It was clear through this coverage that the controversies and conflicts over this proposed legislation were felt most keenly, at least it seems like it from this vantage point, in Montreal, one of Canada's most multicultural and pluralistic society, and one whose spaces are marked indelibly by Quebec's historical connection to the Catholic Church. Given this controversy and others connected to religious pluralism, we very much wanted to invite a scholar from who studies Montreal to discuss the issue of urban religious diversity. And our guest tonight certainly fits that bill. Urban sociologist Annick Germain is a full professor at l'Institut National de la Recherche Scientifique, Centre Urbanisation, Culture, Société. She was the director of the Quebec Metropolis Center, Immigration et Métropole, and has held the position of professor at l'Institut d'Urbanisme of the University of Montreal for over 10 years. Her publications on urban social mix, on how immigration and multiculturalism have made and remade Montreal, and on urban social policy connected to religious and ethnic diversity, all reflect her deep commitment to multi-ethnic Montreal, as well as to urban cosmopolitanism in general. After Professor Germain's talk, we've asked Professor Maged Senbel from the School of Community and Regional Planning at UBC to respond briefly to the talk, especially in terms of its local relevance. As many of you will already know, Dr. Senbel's work focuses on public engagement in long-term neighborhood planning, including through approaches for cultivating inclusive and intercultural visions of a compelling urban future. We can all get behind that, I think. So with no further ado, I will turn the mic over to Annick Germain, who will be talking to us tonight about making space for religious diversity, controversies on places of worship, and city planning in Montreal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. It's always very something special for me to be here in Vancouver, and especially this time because the weather is really wonderful. Is that okay with the microphone? Or you want me to take it off? No? That's okay? Okay. So, I would like to kindly beg your indulgence because my English is not what it should be. And also I have a persistent Belgian accent. So, in recent years, as Karen just told us, religious diversity has become quite a sensitive topic. Well, I wrote an explosive topic, but the translator told me that, well, maybe it's better to say sensitive. So, it was a very, very, very sensitive topic in Quebec. A first controversy emerged in 2007 about a series of incidents of religious nature that were then wrongly presented in the media as reasonable accommodation. This led the Liberal government, then in power, to create the Consultation Commission on Accommodation Practices related to cultural differences, now best known by the names of its two presidents, that is Bouchard-Taylor Commission. The Parti québécois minority government that followed restarted the debate on wider grounds when it presented its Charter of Laicité, then Charter of Value, in August 2013. The controversial document was central to last spring electoral campaign, and many observers also claim that it was central to the Parti québécois defeat. One thing we know for sure is that public opinion was sharply divided on the prohibition of so-called conspicuous religious symbols for public sector employees. That is mainly the Islamic veil, the kippah, and even though large Christian crosses were also to be forbidden. This particular aspect of the Charter divided families, opposed feminists, and even separatists against one another. Yet, in the middle of this heated debate that clearly targeted some religious group more than other, most notably the Muslim community from Maghreb, North Africa, and the Middle East, all the municipalities on the island of Montreal stood united in their refusal to enforce the Charter were it to be adopted by Quebec National Assembly. Such a stark opposition was seen by many observers as stemming from Montreal's very diverse ethnocultural background, while the rest of Quebec is rather homogeneous. Of course, it's the other rock, the rest of Quebec. Let's keep in mind that 9 immigrants out of 10 are settled in the Great Montreal area. So it's 2 Quebec in 1. Should we conclude then that all religions are welcome in Montreal and that religious diversity has become the norm? It is true that the geography of place of worship since the turn of the millennium has revealed the magnitude of this diversity, both in the inner city and in the suburbs, as I will show you later on. Yet, it would be a mistake to believe that even this specific issue of the development of place of worship in Montreal is a completely peaceful one. Montreal's urban landscape has always been dominated by monumental churches and has featured until the mid-20th century a certain diversity of confessions. Then, as immigration accelerated from the 1980s onwards, new types of place of worship began to appear, including in the suburbs, something I will discuss in more detail. However, even though some of these new places of worship were quite massive, they went largely unnoticed, as most of them were built in declining industrial or commercial districts in the middle of a long recession. This state of relative indifference came to an end when economic growth returned in the middle of the 90s, as these places of worship were now competing for space with other, more lucrative users. It is widely known that under the Provincial Act respecting municipal taxation, an old law granting tax exemption to religious organizations, place of worship provide no tax revenue to municipalities. Yet, it will surely come as a surprise to many that this law, designed to reduce the tax burden of some religious organizations, mostly Catholic, that once played a central role in Quebec society, are now largely benefiting non-Catholic confessions. Expansion of existing or construction of new places of worship thus became more complex and tortuous. Yet, such projects remain largely off the radar and never really made headlines. Researchers did not have an interest in them either. I will tell you later how I came across this rich vein of very local controversies that I have since then often referred to as the unexpected order and not the order in unexpected places. It is no coincidence that the debate that took place at the provincial level never explicitly referred to place of worship, which, without a doubt, stand among the most visible and conspicuous forms of expression of religion's diversity. They have elsewhere, for instance in France, where local and national questions are closely intertwined. But in Quebec, I might say that it was a sort of taboo. And it still is, to a large extent. Let me briefly outline three interrelated elements that I believe are, among others, responsible for this situation. There is first the collective dimension of religion, that is its social role over and above rituals, which makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Then there is the fact that new places of worship are almost exclusively associated with minorities, which raises broader question of recognition in Axel Honneth's sense of the term. The third element is that religion pertains to the realm of values, which could be a challenge for city planners in case of conflict, since they strive to remain value-free in their practice. These three elements will be at the core of my presentation, as I believe they are central to the broader social challenge that is making space for religious diversity. I want to begin by briefly introducing myself and my disciplinary outlook on this issue, as I will speak today as an urban sociologist, and Karen rightly says so, and not as a religious scholar or even as a geographer. There is a big geographer in the room. I'm not a geographer. I will then move on to outline a geographical portrait of place of worship in Montreal, focusing on diversity. I will finally present a few examples of what I call social transaction, a notion that I find particularly useful to our broader discussion of cities as spaces to negotiate differences. As a sociologist, I have always been interested in social interaction and less in group per se. The German philosopher Georg Simmel, was the first to notice the ambiguous nature of these relationships that oscillate between proximity and distance. As he wrote in his essay titled Bridge and Door, and I noticed that your building is, the department is exactly on a bridge. So Simmel wrote in his essay Bridge and Door, we are constantly connecting what is separated and separating what is already united in some way. Hence, the ambiguous nature of social ties. I encountered the growing ethnic diversity of our cities early on in my career as a young professor at the Institute of Urban Planning at the University of Montreal. Over the years, I have studied several aspects of the daily lives of immigrants, including housing and neighborhood practices. but always with a focus on understanding how city dwellers, both immigrant and native, live together and share the same urban space. In the early 2000s, I led a study that looked at municipal diversity management practices in the Montreal area. I want to emphasize the word practice here, as the study was not about policies per se, but about the ways in which local stakeholders were dealing with diversity on the ground, in their everyday action that were likely to affect the lives of immigrants. Was diversity taken into consideration at all, and how? This was a crucial question, as the ethnocultural composition of most municipalities in the Montreal area was then shifting rapidly, both in terms of the share of immigrants and minorities in the overall population, as well as the number of countries of origins, which was also increasing. The three areas of municipal action that we looked at were, first, that of social housing, second, that of sports and recreation activities, and finally, that of planning, more specifically, the regulations with respect to place of worship. Within these three broad fields, we tried to identify the concrete practices of local public and community stakeholders, that category including civil servants and elected officials, as well as community organizations. The latter have played a growing role in the provision of local services in recent years. For example, in the management of skating facilities or in the construction and management of social and affordable housing. As a result, municipal practices are now the outcome of a complex network of social relations among a diversity of local actors, over and above, of course, the local population. And it is precisely how this emerging network was working that I want to understand. For instance, what was happening when, in a district with a growing immigrant population, requests for gender-separated hours in public swimming pools were being formulated. Or when the layout of sports facilities and playgrounds had to be changed to accommodate new sports activities imported by immigrants. For instance, the rise of cricket or the growing popularity of soccer relative to baseball. I quickly realized two things during this study. The first one is that practices varied a lot, not only among municipalities, but also among boroughs and neighborhoods within a city. The second is that most of the time, municipal action was very pragmatic. I could even say ad hoc. For the most part, it was more about finding practical arrangement and making compromises to allow diverse people to coexist than about general principles. Social interaction, therefore, play a major role in these cases, and sometimes they take the form of a conflict or a controversy. And here again, Georges Simmel can help us because he shows us that conflicts contain and create social ties, and therefore should not be seen only negatively as situations where social ties may break up. Controversies about the development of places of worship have shown that more often than not, what I call coexistence compromises can be reached even on what is a priori no negotiable, in that case, religion. But before going any further, I would like to underline a few things about the geography of religious diversity in Montreal that I believe will be useful for our discussion. In 2000, when one of my PhD students and I tried to draw a map of religious diversity on the island of Montreal, it proved to be a path-breaking exercise, as such a map had never really been done before. It was also rather tricky, given the ephemeral character of some places of worship, as well as the incomplete and non-exhaustive nature of most sources of information about them. Notwithstanding these methodological difficulties, we estimated that out of 800 places of worship on the island of Montreal, roughly 1/4 were associated to a so-called minority religion: Buddhist, Oriental Christian, Muslim, Jews, Hindus, and so on. On this map, we can see that their spatial distribution is far less concentrated than what is usually assumed. Since then, other maps have been produced by two of my postdoctoral researchers working with me at INRS. Here you can see the map prepared by Frédéric Dejean for evangelical churches. He recently estimated their number to be around 500 in Montreal, as well as in the South Shore suburbs of Longueuil and Brossard. And on those 500, there is 150 Asian, 70 South American, and 40 African. This breakdown is due to the particularly diverse nature of immigration in Montreal in terms of countries of origin. Montreal, as you know, ranks high on an index of super diversity, higher than Vancouver, and even Toronto. Another postdoctoral of mine, Frédéric Castel, has noticed the same fragmented pattern for mosques as we can see on this pie chart. And sorry, it's in French, the pie, but you can understand. It's to show you how diverse what we call mosques. It's a universe very fragmented and very diverse. Another interesting feature of this spatial distribution is the magnitude of religious diversity in the suburbs, such as Laval, that we see on the slide. That will probably not be a surprise to you, since the Vancouver case is much more striking in that respect. But in Montreal, we have nothing like your highway to heaven. A third element is that the buildings themselves vary a lot in terms of visibility, which is in part linked to their heterogeneous spatial pattern of settlement. Some are larger in size, sometimes quite spectacular, with very distinctive traditional architectural features, such as these gurdwaras. The one on the left was built in 2001 on industrial land in the former suburb of La Salle. This is the Murugan temple that opened in 1995 in an industrial area in the West Island. This is the Murugan temple. And then we have some of the large mosques in the Montreal area, one downtown, and the others in the suburbs of Brossard and Ville-Saint-Laurent. I want to specify that most of the suburbs I'm talking about are middle class. But many other places of worship have kept a low profile. Some evangelical and Pentecostal churches are located in profane spaces, such as former retail facilities. This contributes to their inconspicuousness. But it is also the case for mosques. Yet, if ethnic and religious diversity is now visible in the urban landscape, back in the 90s, it was not really socially visible, at least for a majority of municipal employees. In fact, for most of them, religious diversity came as a surprise. Our study showed that they had never anticipated that the growing diversity of immigrants would eventually transform the urban religious landscape. Hence, local authorities were largely caught off guard by the pace of change and by the increasing number of requests from minorities. One last element that most planners were also unaware of is the regional nature of some of the new places of worship that are attracting believers from all over the metropolitan area. While church attendance in Montreal has traditionally been structured around well-defined parishes on a very local scale, this regional scope implies better automobile access, often with a location close to the highway network, as you can see, and more parking space. As we will see, several city officials still require religious groups to provide them with a list of their members' addresses in order to make sure they serve a local clientele, that is, a clientele that pays taxes locally. So, in our study, we carry out 15 case studies on the planning and development of minority places of worship in the Montreal region. We conduct in-depth interviews with urban planners, civil servants in charge of intercultural policies, municipal councillors, architects, ethno-religious leaders, and eventually local residents affected by specific projects. Our sample include 5 mosques, 5 Pentecostal churches, 3 Gurdwaras, 1 Mandir Hindu temple, and we also look at 2 Hasidic synagogues that are not linked to recent waves of immigration, but whose development present a particular spatial constraint, that is, propinquity with residents in a dense inner city area. 2 legal tools may be used by Quebec municipalities when dealing with requests for the establishment of new places of worship or for the expansion of existing facilities. The first one is zoning bylaws that define which use are permitted or prohibited in an area in order to control nuisance. And 2, architectural plans that allow municipalities to control the visual appearance of buildings. Zoning can be interpreted both as a tool of confidence or trust, that is, as a way to protect properties from devaluation due to nuisance, or as a way to keep away what is perceived as alien, as with the old bylaws excluding Chinese laundries in New York City last century, 2 centuries ago. Regulating users can sometimes mean regulating users that we don't want to see in our environment. These two dimensions of zoning are useful to keep in mind for our study. In Montreal, most municipalities had zoning bylaws that did not distinguish place of worship as a specific use. Worried about potential heritage loss planning, caused by the closing down of Catholic churches, the City of Montreal created in 1994 a special zoning category for existing place of worship, all within the broad category of collective and institutional equipment. That means that permits for new place of worship had to be granted as an exception to existing bylaws. This piecemeal approach led to a politicization of the process, politicization in the sense of small politics, that generated controversies that were no more limited to planning. I don't want to go in great depth into this, but I should nonetheless mention that there were also political rivalries between religious groups. There were, for instance, one group that was particularly influential over a planning committee or a political party, and who was not really keen on defending the interest of other religious denominations. In 1998, the City of Montreal decided to authorize place of worship at the ground level in areas zoned for retail users, an ordinance that led to a significant increase in the number of requests. This eventually led city officials to impose a moratorium on the granting of new permits in order to completely review the zoning bylaws. Yet, in 2001, all the municipalities on the island of Montreal were lumped together by the provincial government. This led to a strong decentralization movement through which a lot of responsibilities, including zoning, were transferred to the boroughs. This, of course, only made the situation more complex. Today, planning decisions are generally taken at the borough level, which means that each of the 19 boroughs has its own zoning bylaw, and there are often great differences between boroughs. Borough administrators are beginning to realize that their decision may have important consequences for their neighbors. They often see themselves as competitors, and they try to get as few places of worship as possible, possibly to avoid losing tax revenue. Yet, as we have seen, many of the new places of worship serve a regional clientele, a fact that many boroughs find it difficult to accept, hoping to grant construction or occupancy permit only to local congregations. Second, architectural integration of new construction has become a major concern for municipalities, especially for middle-class suburbs that were planning new upscale residential districts. In one case, the minaret of a mosque was viewed with great apprehension. Intense negotiation took place about architectural integration, but it proved ironic, given the poor visual appearance of the surrounding area, as you can see. A declining strip mall and a large parking lot. In fact, city officials were worried that the view of the minaret might scare off potential home buyers. Religious diversity, therefore, proved very challenging for existing planning tools. Our study also underlined the numerous social transactions that took place and that led to interesting compromises. While negotiating their interests in a very utilitarian manner, stakeholders often succeeded in reaching a compromise, building on informal social interaction that gradually turn into lasting relations of trust and mutual respect. A prerequisite for this was the mutual recognition that all the stakeholders had a legitimate claim to the area, or at least that they could be good neighbors. Negotiations were about concrete issues of everyday urban life and were not about religion per se. One example is that of a resident committee that obtained from a neighboring synagogue. You can see on the picture the synagogue. It's two houses in the middle of the street. The synagogue was planning an expansion on a residential street, and the resident committee obtained that they installed an air conditioning system that would allow them to keep the windows shut in the summer months, thereby reducing nuisance during religious ceremony. In other cases, an imam argued with neighbors that a mosque would make a better neighbor than a restaurant or a bar, since Muslims do not drink alcohol and do not go to the mosque every day in large numbers. In many cases, these controversies turn out to be instructive both for religious leaders that learn to better explain the functioning of their place of worship, and for neighbors that gradually came to know their new neighbors. Less successful examples had generally taken a legal path early on in the process. In the past few years, Montreal Intercultural Council has been addressing the issue of place of worship, and a working group has been created by the City Council in order to harmonize practices between boroughs under increasing pressure from local planners worried about the growing number of undeclared places of worship. But nothing has really happened so far. And in way of conclusion, I would like to elaborate on this impasse and the reasons why I believe the issue of minority place of worship has become a sort of taboo. Three elements contribute, but among others, contribute to making minority place of worship a taboo subject in Quebec. And these three elements are interrelated in a context where, as we know, Catholic countries are known to be less open to other religions and also less open to immigration. The first one pertains to the collective nature of the activities taking place in such building. In Quebec, we often hear that religious activities should remain in the private sphere. Going one step further, it is also often assumed that they should not enter public space, and thereby they should not be visible in public space. Yet, as urban researchers, we know the difference between public space as an abstract space for public debate, and public space as physical spaces that should be open to all. I don't want to spend more time discussing last year's debate about conspicuous religious symbols. I would rather talk about the social and community activities that often complement religious rituals, as many places of worship are not used just for praying. They also provide room for a series of community activities, for instance, for kids or the elderly. In Sikh temple, hospitality is sacred and the cafeteria is open to all. Many places of worship pursue important educational missions. This is often an important aspect of the life of immigrants, for instance, in evangelical churches. In many religions, rituals and social activities are two closely interrelated aspects of the community building process. Yet, this collective aspect is often either unknown or simply unwanted. In terms of zoning, many planners would rather separate religious and community space in order to constrain tax breaks to the former, or simply to ban places of worship from areas zoned for community uses. It is therefore the social function and the collective nature of religious groups that are looked with suspicion. Could it be because they are competing with services already provided by local authorities or by other community organizations, as several of my informants claimed? Or is it related to a rigid Republican ideal opposed to anything that interferes between citizens and the state, as in France? Some planners also fear that places of worship that are generally attended at specific times by a specific group of people might occupy strategic location and thereby take the place of other equipments that could serve and thus attract a wider audience. For example, the city of Trois-Rivières has prohibited any new religious uses from several streets of its historic downtown core. The second element I want to stress is that this debate about place of worship is generally about the religion of others, that is, most often of immigrants. Religious diversity is seen as the alarming symptom of a larger religious comeback or resurgence within our secular society. Yet, studies have shown that the so-called proliferation of places of worship, that figure 10, is more related to the growing ethnocultural diversity than to any sort of religious fervor outbreak. When 2 or 3 places of worship open in the same neighborhood, even if they are all sunny, for instance, it is not necessarily because of religious fervor or local demographic growth. Most of the time, it shows that the neighborhood's immigrant population is made out of different ethno-linguistic and denominational subgroups, among which links can be very tenuous. It is a fine line between religion and religious diversity, and the question of place of worship makes it particularly obvious. Several studies have shown that non-immigrants do indeed attend a variety of non-Catholic places of worship, yet the only new place of worship to appear in the urban landscape are those built by minorities. All this while the closing of underused Catholic churches and convents, and a lot of them old heritage buildings, becomes a major challenge for planners. And planners in Quebec remain generally white and of Catholic backgrounds. Finally, the third element I want to discuss is that for many planners, these religious buildings are associated with conflicts of value. For example, religion versus atheism, a perception that is contradicted by our own results that show that most of the time controversies emerge out of very practical questions that have very little to do with religion. For instance, the number of parking spaces, traffic noises, and so on. The current obsession for social cohesion often translates into a very negative view of controversies and conflict that is unlikely to provide ground for negotiation and compromise. Yet, leaving the broad question of recognition and human rights aside, one can argue that religious diversity will never be managed in any satisfactory way by planning regulation alone. Social interactions, negotiation, and conflict are an essential part of the process, and more broadly, an essential component of city life. I am firmly convinced that such a flexible and open process can be socially very productive. How then do we overcome the taboo surrounding the issue of place of worship? Discussions such as the one we will have tonight are clearly part of the solution, and I'm therefore very grateful for the opportunity to discuss these Montreal findings with you. Religious diversity brings about a growing number and variety of places of worship that in turn produce new urban forms that need to be acknowledged and accounted for, especially by local officials. These new forms are the result of imaginative adaptation to the various constraints of urban environments. And I have no doubt some of these new places of worship will be important components of tomorrow's religious heritage. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Annick. My name's Peter Hall. Karen Ferguson had to slip out to head back to her class, but I'm very pleased to welcome Magid Senbal and to give some response comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and thank you, Professor Germain, for a really very rich set of insights, and I think we would be well served to emulate this kind of research here in Vancouver. I think it's certainly needed, and there's a lot that can be revealed by looking at our current conflicts and in some cases some positive outcomes of the conflicts as well. And in a way, I feel like a better person to have been up here is my brother Sharif Senbal, who's actually an architect who's designed 5 mosques here and has really engaged with local authorities as well as his clients in trying to realize the aspirations of And so I come to this with secondhand experience as well as my expertise in urban planning. And as a Muslim, of course, as you know, I consider myself part of many of the communities that I'll briefly touch upon. What I was asked to do is to try to bring a local story in a way to your insights. And there are many similarities, certainly. I mean, the one obvious one is that we continue to have a mostly white male planning profession, which is not in itself an issue if it wasn't for the difficulty sometimes in relating to the communities that they serve. You mentioned the highway to heaven, so I'll have to also touch on that. I think it's a common story of beginning in marginal space. And we have it here. We see it along Hastings, we see it along Kingsway, where you see vacancies, commercial vacancies, shop fronts that are relatively affordable to lease, and that becomes a starting point for often new immigrants who are looking for a place of community and identity, and so from what I call that marginal space, they go to the margins. Typically the physical margins of the city where it's literally the edge, and that's where the highway to heaven has been really the edge for a long time. But before I go there, the one advantage we have, particularly with mosques in Vancouver, is that because the direction to pray, the direction of Mecca, is more or less north, then churches are great places to convert, and there's been many examples of churches as they lose their congregations are converted to mosques, and there you have it. It's the perfect direction if it's a north-south building. In other places in North America where you start to see that angle tilt, it's a lot more awkward to have those conversions. But the highway to heaven is peculiar case because there's an often ignored physical hazard to being so close to the freeway, and there are many studies that talk about environmental racism or injustice, where locating amenities, particularly that include a youth population or even younger. There are studies about the respiratory ailments of young children within 500 meters of a freeway. And there's no question that every one of those buildings is within 500 meters, and you have the BC Muslim Association school that's right there, playground right outside, and that actually represents a hazard and a risk. So it's a marginal land in lots of ways. There are also, in the lifetime of these buildings, what was marginal land on the margins, invariably over time becomes desirable land, that's contested because the cities grow, and often that's where you see the most interesting land use changes and rezonings happen, and we see that with gentrification in places like the downtown east side, where what was once really cheap and marginal all of a sudden becomes the place to be. And that's where the contestation really happens and conflict happens. And in the Lower Mainland, we've, as far as I know, whenever the projects are at the edge of the city, there's been very little opposition. It's when it's close to an established community that all of a sudden you have this undesirable element disguised as a parking problem, or disguised as a traffic problem. And actually the traffic is a legitimate issue, and parking is a legitimate issue. But these are issues that can be quantified and solved. and addressed, whereas certainly the fear of change is a lot more abstract, and often that's what people are responding to. The symbolism of the architecture is interesting because, and I'll speak directly about Sharif's projects here, where I'm not just promoting my brother's work, he's a fantastic architect, but this is something that we've actually written about together and have presented on, and what's called a regional architecture that's really based on local materials, and local systems, and that actually goes back. I mean, he spends quite a bit of time working with his community clients, going back to what the liturgical requirements are for mosques, and there are none. There is no requirement for a minaret or a dome. All you need is a piece of ground and a place to wash, and even if you don't have a place to wash, you can clean yourself with stone. And so he goes to great lengths to convince his clients that let's come up with something that's regional and of this place that you've chosen to immigrate, and of this place that your children and grandchildren will be of. You know, they're of here and not of any other place. And so of course he struggles with many different interpretations of what constitutes a religious building or a mosque that is really from their place of origin. And then you start to unpack some of what is invested in creating those places, and it's really holding on to an identity, a culture, trying to pass on to children what they had, fearing complete dilution of their cultures, and legitimately so for many reasons. But then it goes back to okay, given that it's of this place and can have more to do with light and glass and a connection to the divine and a lot of these powerful associations, it actually they go full circle to, well, we still need a symbol to kind of claim that we are here and we're not powerless, we're not afraid of our identity, and so that's often how it comes back as not necessarily a requirement but an expression of identity, and then it can take on its own form and often quite an atypical or a non-traditional form, where it's made of glass or it's hollow or whatever the case may be. So, and the parking issue, as a planner, I hate to raise the stature of the car in any way, but what often starts as a conflict becomes a source of bridging, because especially if you have two institutional buildings side by side, where you have the parking needs of one being at a different time than the other, especially mosques and churches, Fridays and Sundays. It makes perfect sense for a city to try to create some kind of agreement between the two, so that the churchgoers park in the mosque parking lot on Sundays and vice versa on Fridays. So there are a number of cases where that kind of synergy has happened. So the car that is often used to turn down projects becomes a source of connection. The one last thing I wanted to mention is that in there's a threshold often that communities feel where they are only relevant to politicians once they've achieved a certain threshold of having a building. And once they have a building, then there's all kinds of political attention that descends upon them, and during times of elections or on any occasion, a religious occasion, you hear, well, this is the premier, message from the premier, message from your local representative, and so forth. But in order to get, if you don't have a building and you're trying to get one through, you're not worthy of any politician's time. And so that becomes a real source of, it really undermines the confidence of many communities, to the point where feeling that loss of power, there's been a couple of occasions where a community feels like, okay, well, now to play the game I have to locate and in a place that's not zoned for a place of worship, we'll purchase the building somehow, warehouse or whatever the case may be, office building, and over time we'll win them over and get rezoned as a way to kind of get that political power. And in some cases with full advice that's just not what the city is at all interested in doing, because the city has many other competing priorities and they want to preserve that land for whatever reasons, yet, and it ultimately ends up being a case where they have to relocate again. It's that desperate attempt to have a bit of power. So really just a few local stories, hopefully they add to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. I wanted to just ask Annick if you wanted to respond to any of those comments and then open it up to the floor.
Just one comment. I can't imagine the Catholic hierarchy in Quebec accepting the conversion of a Catholic church to a mosque. And that's a big problem because, as you can imagine, we have huge amounts of empty churches, and it's an enormous problem. And we know that the hierarchy do prefer the conversion of a church into condominiums instead of place of worship.
And it's served the affordable housing sector quite well in Quebec to convert to the conversion from churches to condominiums, but it hasn't necessarily served the...
Well, not exactly, because, as you know, Catholic churches are usually big monument, very expensive for the
refurbish,
chauffage, to
refurbish, renovate.
No, to heat.
Yeah.
So that's a problem. So it's not that much interesting for affordable housing.
So perhaps converting the condominiums to mosques is first to condominiums and then to mosques or temples. Or one way to get around the law.
That's
Some Vancouver perspective slipping in here on the relative value of land and appropriate uses thereof. Please, fire away.
Hi there, thanks for coming to Vancouver. My name is Dennis. I'm from a small town in Eastern Ontario. There's 3,000 people, 4 churches, and most of them are slowly kind of shrinking. But there's one, the Dutch Reformed Church, which is pretty much a normal Protestant church, like not recognizable. And they didn't have a building; they were housed in a Catholic school, and they chose a site. They developed a plan to build this huge community center surrounding their church. The problem is that it was in agricultural land, like not protected agricultural land, but there's provincial policy that protects all agricultural land, and not contiguous with the town at all, and just kind of out on its own. And it just ended up that my father ended up kind of leading a fight against it. And so it wasn't necessarily that it was a minority religion, as kind of is the focus of your research, but just that it was against kind of good land use principles. And so I'm curious to see, like if you've seen any municipalities that have come up kind of against that or for that, or any different approaches kind of to that issue of agricultural land. I know you mentioned, like, is the Highway of Heaven, is that Highway 99? I missed that. Is that? It's Oh, okay, in Richmond. Yeah, where it's a lot of the similar issue is that there's agricultural land in Richmond that's fairly valuable to the region, and that's kind of different because Like you mentioned, that a lot of different faiths have gotten pushed there because they, come up against even more issues in built-up urban areas with kind of NIMBYism, whereas this is kind of different in that it's kind of the mainstream Protestant religion. So I'm just curious if you've seen that, like land use, mainstream Protestant or whatever churches coming up against land use and different approaches.
Well, not in my knowledge, but maybe I'm wrong, at least in Quebec. But, well, one difference between Quebec and BC is the kind of immigration we have. We have more small communities, a little bit of everything, and we have no huge community. So that means no huge amount of money also, okay? So the problem is not exactly the same as in here in BC or even in Toronto. That's a specific problems, as I could say, of Quebec to have such a diversity and as you know, we have less immigrants, of course, than in Toronto, for sure. But all those immigrants are very different from a country of origins and so on, linguistic question. So it's different that the situation in BC on that matter. So, for instance, the idea to have a church as the starting point of a new residential project is not conceivable in Quebec.
Dan.
Can I give an example from Alberta, just on that
Please.
question, where it's on the edge of Calgary, and it's agricultural land that a Muslim community bought a distance from the city, and sound land use planning would suggest that you do not just build a community out in or even a religious institution all the way out there, and so they hadn't done any planning. It was agricultural land that would eventually be rezoned, but they insisted that it not just go forward as a mosque, but that it actually be the beginning of a master plan of a new urbanist community that's out there on that greenfield land. And so they had to go through quite an extensive, larger planning process to show how this might be the beginning of and a contributor to a larger community. And even so, in the end, the planners advised against it, but council approved it, just because of the political pressure to do so.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Annick. I really enjoyed the presentation a lot. The question or comment I have may relate to the difference between Vancouver and Montreal, or British Columbia and Quebec, and that would be an interesting way to think about it. But what it seems to me is that in the situation that you're portraying, you have people kind of classified into two categories. It's minorities and religious and non-Catholic, non-Christian, and it's whites and secular and post-Catholic, I suppose. And it seems like almost a wedge that further divides these groups. And I don't know, again, whether this is a Vancouver versus Montreal thing or whether it's just like the mentality of these particular controversies that have arisen. But here, I think people don't make quite so easy distinctions between these categories. So, if I look, for example, at the Iranian population in Metro Vancouver, something between 50 and 60% are Muslim, but the other 40% are no religious identity, or Zoroastrian, or Christian, or Baha'i. So when we look at the Iranian population, we don't just simply think of it as not secular because, well, 35% are secular or non-religious anyway. And at the same time, we have also in parts of our city mega churches that are very strongly espousing an evangelical version of Christianity that mainly are associated with whites. So we don't make that as clear a distinction. And I wonder if it maybe is a little bit more polarized in the way people in Montreal view these things compared to the way that they're viewed in Vancouver. Just some thoughts. I'm not even sure that's really a question. It's more comments, but you might have comments on the comments.
Well, I do agree with you. In a way, it's fascinating. Quebec is the province where, in the not the last census, but the one before, where you have the few percentage of people saying, I have no religion, okay? And BC, it's the highest, okay? But in the collective representation, people in Quebec are seeing themselves are without religion, okay? So people in Quebec would be the first to be surprised that so many people say to the census, well, so few people say to the census, well, I have no religion. So I think it's a kind of representation of what Quebec is, of what it is it is the dream of a generation. It's linked to the Révolution tranquille. And I think most of our politicians, most of our civil servants are from that generation. Okay? But that generation is really important because it takes all the place in the public debate. And so the reality is much more complex, of course, but it's a question of imagination.
Please.
Hi there. I'm wondering if in your research you've sort of noticed that the situation in Montreal with the conflicts between various social or religious groups is sort of an extension of what's happened in the rest of Quebec and some of the smaller communities where they have perhaps reacted very strongly against immigrants or other social groups potentially coming into their community, even though they have not actually shown up in those communities. I don't recall which community it was that banned stoning, I think? Okay. So I'm not sure if the same sort of social impulses that happened in those small towns is sort of happening in Montreal, just with the sort of adjustment of having much larger social groups around them to sort of temper that.
I'm not sure I understood what's your comment. Aude Claire, can you help me?
So your question was what, like the small communities?
Yeah, it was about the conflicts within Montreal, whether they are sort of a version of what's happening in the smaller communities, except that in Montreal those impulses are sort of tempered by the fact that Montreal is a much more diverse community that has many more ethnic groups and social groups.
Okay, so my understanding of the question is, like really the differences between small communities and, like bigger cities. So for instance, like the reaction that you have in small towns, such as Evansville or, like other, like small communities, and, like what happens in bigger cities, such as in Montreal. And if there is a link between, like those two, so that's my understanding, maybe, like.
Yeah, I think you remember what happened in Evansville with the charter that was posted on the entrance to Equiville, you know, stone everybody to death here, and such and such and such, which the Taylor-Bouchard Commission took up. So I think you're asking whether what's happening in Montreal is a version of Hérouville tempered by big city standards. But
Hérouville, it was a fake. It was it was a politician who built a story for the media, and he was laughing a lot, okay, because everybody took him seriously, okay. Hérouville, it's well, of course it was important because it has such an impact of the international media and so on. But in fact, the man who started that rumor, well, he was really clever, and it was a fake. So it has nothing to do with small community, big community. It was of course after we realized that it was a fake, but on the moment with the affaire Hérouville, we were maybe those poor people they don't know immigrants, they see only once in their lifetime and so on. But at the end of the day, it was a joke. And what is terrible is that almost all the issue raised by the media concerning reasonable accommodation were false. They were not reasonable accommodation. The same story with the maple syrup. It was a fake also, you know. So it's unbelievable. You can create a huge crisis with nothing. And I think one big problem we have in Quebec is that right now people are sort of schizophrenic. How to say that? People are squeezed. There is a gap between, on one level, the public discourse, the discourse of politicians, discourse of media, and so on. And on the other level, it's my reality of every day, my very concrete reality. And on the everyday life, no problem. No problem. Anywhere in Quebec, it's okay. But as soon as you read the newspaper, as soon as you watch TV, as soon as the politician make a discourse, it's huge crisis. And so people do not, what are the most true? Is it the public discourse, or is it what they saw every day, and which is very banal? And I think the problem for us, professors, intellectuals, and so on, it's what we do with that. It's not easy. And I think that's the reason why now I'm convinced that we have to describe the very banal everyday life of people, and to explain that that's the reality. The reality is not the public discourse, it's that. But up to now, there is a huge gap between the two reality, in a way. If I can, I don't know if I'm explaining myself clearly, and that's very dangerous in a way. And I think it's very dangerous.
Follow-up question, please. Not on that one. If I may, from the pulpit, I absolutely hear what you're saying about the banal. Isn't there something about religion that allows it to be recruited in those elite contests, as well as also be amplified for ordinary folks? I mean, I think where religion is contested within the Lower Mainland is when it gets recruited and amplified in discourses and anxieties about cost of living and wealthy immigrants and et cetera. That's when it becomes drawn into contest. And so I guess that would be another way of sort of asking, what are the contours that draw religious location into those elite conflicts within Quebec? Yeah.
Well, I have to think about it, because it's not easy.
Mm-hmm. Please,
follow
up on that.
Merci beaucoup, Annick. I just have a quick question, like about you started your lecture by saying that the municipalities of the Greater Montreal decided to stand against the Charter of Values, and I just would like maybe if it's possible to elaborate on that point, why you decided to stand up against like this, as governance.
Well, that was really, really impressive because, as I said, everybody were divided, families, everybody. But very early on in the debate, all the municipalities on the island of Montreal, and it was almost on the very beginning, they made a declaration that they will ask for some exemption that the charter will not be applied to their territory. And well, at the beginning I thought, well, I'm not sure they will keep going like that. But up to the end, they succeed. And I think that because the mayors of all those municipalities really know that their population is highly diverse and that it's impossible to think about implementation such a charter. It would be a nightmare for everybody. But they were the only one to take that position. The suburbs in the North Shore and the South Shore, they say, yes, the charter is a good thing and so on, because they have few immigrants. But for the mayor on the island of Montreal, it was clear that it was a very bad, divisive thing, and that was they know their population in a way, and I think one thing it's interesting is that it shows us that the municipal scene, the level, it's not the national one. And it's very, very different. Of course, in Quebec, cities have very few powers, and they have less powers than in other provinces, by the way. But it's the political game, it's completely different than at the national level. It's exactly the opposite in France, where the mayor is, the president is often a former mayor and so on. Here in Quebec, there is a total disconnection between the two level, and I think, thank God.
Can I just follow up on that? You said that in the island of Montreal they know their population, but you described it as political expediency rather than knowledge that maybe there's nothing to fear with that difference. So is there a more charitable interpretation that they have greater experience with diversity and are less fearful of it?
No, I think they have real, genuine sensibility.
Yes.
To the diversity.
Yes, that's good. That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, I think so.
It's a genuine sensibility to diversity as opposed to just knowing that it would be impossible to implement and that, okay.
Yeah.
In the front, please, on there. Thank you.
I am from Montreal. I am architect and planner, and I work to save church in the island of Montreal. So, be on your guard, I will speak English. The point is, in Montreal, you have, on the island of Montreal, more than 600 churches. Most of them are underused, or they are not used at all. They are, how to say that, big church, expensive to keep, but on the other hand, they are very important in the landscape. And we try to keep them not for religious point of view, but to a contribution to the community. I mean, to the landscape, to the way we live, to the way things should be. Is it possible to think, and when you say that, Annick said that there is 500 evangelical church in the island, and we have 600 Catholic church. Between evangelical and Catholic is not a big I don't know, big bridge. I mean, I do think it's shorter than to the Muslim. Is it possible to have a kind of policy and said, look, we use the church for other religious and for other use? If you go to Amsterdam, I mean, you will see that one church will be used for a bistro during the week, and during Sundays will be for a religious thing. And try to have a solution to combine, I mean, the cultural value altogether and the need of people about religion. I'm sorry to speak like that, but we cannot go in one way and forget everything around. I mean, it's impossible. Otherwise, I mean, we'll scrap the culture we have, I mean, at least in Quebec.
Yes, but the big boss doesn't want. And how to say that, the archevêque? Bishop? Well, he says no. That's all.
You can't drop an architect.
Yeah, but
if he doesn't want it, fair.
I'm just wondering if you could speak to what the ethno-racial diversity in the Catholic Church is in Montreal, because it seems that, you know, the Church has had to rely on immigration in order to sustain itself almost everywhere, and I'm just wondering if that isn't the case as well there.
Yes, you're perfectly right. The population of the Catholic Church in Montreal are very diverse. That's for sure. No doubt. You're right. You're right.
So does that challenge the picture around thinking about social interactions and questions around the recognition of minorities within this picture a bit, or how does that impact on this kind of...
I'm not sure that it has such an impact yet. But, well, maybe it's too early. Well, we always have to think that things are changing so fast, and people have needs time to get used to. And I think, but for the moment, in my view, it has no impact.
I just want to comment on a lot of the images that you showed in your PowerPoint. They're the buildings themselves without the crowd, and it's sort of the commentary on the structure of the building, whether it fits into the environment or not. But one of the things that I was thinking of as I was watching, seeing those images, is that really it's not the building. It's the crowd that comes to the building of racialized bodies that are at issue. So it's not, it's whether there's minarets or whatever, like people can get over that, but those are just easier ways for them to try and articulate or not articulate their racism, because it's the bodies, and it's sort of, it's about the body, it's about the visible symbols of difference, and it's about, you know, the same way that people talk about the smell of an Indian restaurant, but it's not the smell, it's the Indian people that eat at an Indian restaurant. That is a really big issue.
Yes, of course. But you know that mosque, which is actually the biggest one in Montreal, and it's interesting because it started many years ago with a small house, what we call veteran house, the house for the soldier coming back from the war. Veterans. Well, and it was a very small house, and I think there was 3 or 4 renovation to make it bigger and bigger and bigger, and now it's the biggest. Okay, but in a way, it's located on a highway, sort of, and I don't think that for that mosque the problem is the body, as you said, because people are going by car, so they don't see all the crowd, the Friday and so on, you know. And in that case, it was really the symbol of the minaret, which was high and which could be seen from new development more far. But on the other side, you are right that quite often the apprehension of population are, well, if I have such a place of worship in my neighborhood, that means that all people from visible minorities will come and live in my neighborhood. And people are, it's the first reaction. But sometimes, I saw some urban planners explaining to people that, not necessarily, because they are coming from everywhere in the Montreal region. So it will not necessarily change your neighborhood. And such explanation was important to calm down the fear, and it was okay after that. So, but of course, it's not always easy, and it's not every city planner who can do that, and who can face the fear of the people and put a name on that and discuss. But when it happens and when the discussion is well conducted, it can be fruitful.
Please, more questions.
Thank you for your talk. It was really quite stimulating. As you know, as I told you earlier before the talk, I also grew up in Montreal, and it turns out we're neighbors, so separated by some years. Both lived on a harbor. Like Ithrat, I was quite taken by the photographs that you showed, in the sense that I haven't been to Montreal in it seems like forever. And so looking at those pictures of Brossard, Longueuil, it really brings back memories. And I'm struck by your conclusion in the sense that when I'm looking at the words conflict and peaceful coexistence, I think back to, growing up in Montreal as a very young boy, as a young man, as an immigrant, as a Chinese Canadian immigrant, who, as I was telling Maggie earlier before we came in, growing up Muslim in Montreal, but living in Côte-Saint-Luc, in Hampstead, in NDG, going to a predominantly Jewish high school, Westville High School, which you may know, which is right off. Being a Chinese immigrant who is Muslim, growing up in a Jewish neighborhood, in an Anglophone community in the Francophone province, I experienced a lot of conflict.
So some of it internal.
Not all of it internal. I'm thinking about this notion of conflict leading to this word peaceful coexistence. And I don't have much experience with the issue of, this sort of landscape of places of worship, but I do have experience of it in the sense of social interaction and, if you will, public negotiation of public space, and political space, and civic space. I'm wondering if you could just expand on that notion. When I think back to growing up in Montreal, in that context, in that, I guess we could use that word, in that very multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious context, I found that those negotiations do not always lead to peaceful coexistence. So I'm just wondering if you could just expand on the conclusion. I'm really intrigued by the notion of conflict leading to, if you will, this notion of peace.
Well, we have to remember that, well, one of my colleagues, Marie McAndrew, was talking about Quebec as a fragile majority, okay? And that means that it's a kind of majority, the French Canadian, who see themselves as the majority in Quebec, of course, but there is always a feeling of fragilité, fragile, okay? And one consequence of that perception is that in Quebec, people are afraid of conflicts. Conflict is something which could be very damaging, okay? And it's difficult to have my version of conflict, which could be productive of social links, okay? But I know that for many French Canadians, it's difficult to accept that idea. In other words, either for them, either you are living in peace or you are living in conflict. And in between, there is nothing, okay? It's war or peace. But in everyday life, it's not like that. You are always going through little tension, little friction. It's not always war or peace. It's more middle range, as I could say. But I think it's a question of history in Quebec, and it's difficult to accept that. But I think it's a question of generation. As I said before, the generation who realized the Révolution tranquille is now gray hair, but the young generation is more comfortable with my version of conflicts, with small, and they do not fear to negotiation and so on. And but it's a question of generation. So I'm optimistic.
Thank you. Two in the front after you. Thanks.
Hi. I have a question about public space as a place of worship. So we've talked about the different buildings that are built by different religious groups, but in your research, have you come up with spaces where people of different faith groups actually opt to use maybe public spaces to worship, and how does that and how has, I guess, planning, particularly zoning or use or zone or bylaws, either hindered or helped people to be able to use public space as places of worship? I also say this I've noticed a trend, particularly amongst my peers, and even in reading different articles, on individuals that are could be in the millennial generation or even slightly older as well, not wanting to go to big mosques or not wanting to go to big churches, and are looking to have smaller gatherings in their homes or, and particularly in nature and in parks. So how has that maybe come up in your research on allowing for that inclusivity within public spaces?
Well, of course, my talk, in a way, was a little bit simplistic because the portrait is much more complex, and there is we know that there is the development of new ways to practice religion, and we have to take that into consideration, of course. But my point was really on a city planning problem. So it's I know that the whole portrait of religious practice is much more complex than what I show with those slides, because I'm only talking about place of worship. So the
physical building.
Yeah, exactly. So but well, because that was the viewpoint I took from an urban planning view. But you're right, it's much more diverse than what I show, in a way.
If I may add, I belong to a group called Architecture, Culture, and Spirituality, and within that there's a subgroup in which we're pushing for a reconceptualization of nature in the city as possibly a place of reflection on our common humanity, our common destiny, particularly as it relates to fragile ecological systems and our consumer cultures and so forth, and how that may potentially be a place of awe and a place of multi-faith understanding and faith broadly defined, however people choose to worship. That it's not necessarily about specific religious buildings and institutions, but perhaps there's a religiosity that can emerge into the public sphere, particularly around nature at first, but also around other symbolic, grandiose kind of architectural arrangements. One of my colleagues has done a lot of studies across different cultures on what gives people a sense of awe when they are in a space or in a room, whether it's a natural room or a fabricated room.
There were two questions in the front.
I see personally as a matter of money involved. Maybe I'm wrong in the issues of expanding municipalities and type of thing.
I'm not sure.
Within different groups of religion to build new mosques and synagogue. It's many issues maybe as well involved in conflicts. Do they have the money to build these particular mosques or synagogues, or to do renovations or in different buildings?
So yeah, I mean, you touched upon it when you talked about, and perhaps if I'm interpreting your question, when you talked about the loss of a tax base, and so are you saying that the money for the city or money for the communities, that they have barriers to raising money?
That's right.
Okay, I see. Yeah. So that's certainly
Because I think Montreal had, in the last couple of years, difficulties and various conflicts with the mayor, different mayors in power, such and such thing, and so that is part of as well of the subject.
so the corruption in the construction industry is, and so the city is trying to make money.
Yes, in making decisions to approve new projects.
Well, I'm not sure I understand, but maybe because I'm tired. Well, I don't know. Well.
Maybe I'm mixing.
So maybe just speak to the tax issue then.
Yeah. Well, I know that some cities in the Montreal region try to get rid of the law, the provincial law, which gives tax exemption to churches. But it's impossible. And it would be unfair, because that means that the Catholic churches have enjoyed a regime that the new ones will never. But of course, they try. And they also try, up to now, to separate what in the building is exactly for prayer and what is social activities. And because they think that if they can make a separation, a special separation, they could tax the social activities, but they can't tax the prayer. Good luck.
Thank you. I think there was one more.
I'm a pastor of a local church in Burnaby, but I also sit on, I'm co-chair of our Burnaby Interfaith Network. And one of our goals, I got two observations, is one of our goals on the Interfaith Network is to try to prevent conflicts. Not that there are a lot of conflicts in our city, but I like the concept of the bridges and the doors, because we attempt to foster understanding, build bridges between communities, to bring them together to cultivate mutual understanding of each other. And so we do events. I think a lot of the conflicts that arise come out of total misunderstanding of what even the religious practices or beliefs are of the particular religion. And so then they're stereotyped, and then there's automatic judgments, which then creates the prejudice, it creates the distance. So I think that for communities, we're just starting, we've been only in existence for a few years, but I think if our communities work harder at cultivating understanding, we prevent a lot of the conflicts. That would be one observation. As a pastor of a local church, I understand that in my community, I'm sure there's a lot of residents who, when they drive down to City Hall to pay their taxes once a year, probably curse my church because we sit on prime property and don't pay taxes. I haven't really done the history of the research into how churches became tax exempt, but I would imagine at least one part of it at one point in time was the perception that the presence of that church in that community made that community a better place to live. But I suspect right now that the perception of most people, and I think it's we've earned that perception. So, and in my church, we're trying to do what we can to tear it down or to break that down. Is that place of worship, regardless of what faith they represent, tend to be self-serving as opposed to serving the community. And so all the functions that take place probably are primarily focused on themselves. And I would understand, residents being resentful of their taxes paying for that property to be able to, that they gain no benefit from it. To my right understanding, Burnaby probably has not zoned for churches at least in 20 to 30 years. And I think it's an economic issue. But it's an economic issue that I think I would suggest that municipalities would zone for place of worship. But part of the requirement of the zoning is for the organization that applying for the zoning to say, what are you going to do to invest into this community to make it a better place? We require commercial properties to say, how are you going to create green space? I would suggest that would be a possible solution to at least part of the economic thing, is to say, how do you build into your communities here? Because the taxing is a big thing, because money is very tight these days in most municipalities. And to sit on prime property and not pay a dime back in without the community benefiting from your presence seems to me a contradiction. So I would suggest that that's a requirement that should be made for a place of worship.
Great. Are there any final comments, responses to that, or any final questions? Thanks very much, everyone, for coming.